really is an incredible honor to be back in the town I grew up in, and haven't actually lived in for an awful long time. But an extremely formative time here. I think of myself probably as a South African more than any other nationality. I've lived in 4 different countries. So, wow, thank you so much for inviting me. What we do is pretty much what Michael talked about. We're normal kind of architects, but we happen to have got into this field, being involved in workplace and in designing large organizational communities, and almost always communities that have been in a state of transformation. And those companies that have come to us have always been about how do you effect a radical kind of change in behaviors and in ways of working so that the companies can kind of be equipped for dealing with the rapid changes that are happening in our current era, probably our era running forward as well. So I made the talk, the social agenda of buildings. What is it that's so important about this? And it's really interesting that office buildings have been so thinly conceived over the last 100 years, whereas other aspects of our lives have been so well considered. And if you just think about the way in which lifestyles with the modern house, in fact, even houses over the last sort of few hundred years, have been designed with such a consideration about the variety of activities we do in those structures, and so much care and attention has been put into them. And yet our workplace, where we actually spend the majority of our waking lives, as Michael was saying, is really thought of in this kind of thin, kind of financial terms. Anyway, so what is a social agenda? Architecture frames the theater of human experience, and it addresses a number of really, really critical things. We've got community structures, we've got knowledge sharing. Primary reason to go into work is to share knowledge. Choice and opportunity, social bonds, the friendships and the sort of tribes we form within the workplace, and tribal connectivity itself. And we've come a long way over the last century. We've been driven by incredible technological change. On the left is the image of workers in the 1920s in America. And the organization of the workplace then was, I think in many ways, really quite a cynical exploitation of people. The Taylorist model was used, which was really about bringing efficiency processes into the manufacturing of industrial components, and then people were basically churned into the same type of organizational structure. And so we had the sort of the factory kind of thought process being applied to people, first in the industrial process, secondly in the service industry, which actually overtook the industrial age in the 1920s, where there were more white-collar workers than blue-collar workers. And now we've moved to an age where kind of represented by the sort of collaboration, well, not necessarily collaboration, but the market energy of a trading floor, which has become actually much more typical of so much of what happens in the workplace today. And to use Marshall McLuhan's statement, we continue to use old tools to solve new problems. I always think that's very revealing because we do it so consistently and in a way so thoughtlessly. So the Taylorist model is kind of satirized, I think, in this by the 60s it had taken hold so much. It's satirized in this fabulous image from Jacques Tati's Playtime movie in France in 1967, where Monsieur Hulot is faced with confusion about who to actually connect with in a workplace where people are all in their own cubicles, which have become rooms, and it's mechanized to the extreme. So this is the kind of dilemma of the workplace, and that everyone's familiar with. You either have two options: you have a desk or an office. And inevitably, the status issues that run with having an office have created a kind of a ladder climbing process in the workplace, which really has nothing to do with good work and nothing to do with productivity, ultimately. To sort of wind this backwards, we've gone through, in the last 300 years, the most kind of cataclysmic change that's happened in history. In the organization of production and in the organization of how people work and work together. So we've gone from an agricultural economy, which was rurally based. The workforce was frequently the family. It was fundamentally immobile, and the process was seasonally driven, so it was climate-based. Then the industrial process, which everyone's very familiar with, urban, manpower, stationary, and linear. And then from the 20s onwards, predominantly the service economy, the white-collar economy, suburban, brain power, increased mobility, and demand-based. But we're in an era now which I don't think everyone's agreed on what the term is, but we think it's the idea economy because there are so many businesses today live and die by their ideas. So we're constantly working with companies who acknowledge that issue and really want to change the world of collaboration and community within the workplace in order to kind of really leverage brain power and have ideas come to the top, irrespective of where they are on any kind of hierarchical basis. Thank goodness, because the hierarchies tend to flatten and destroy ideas. So we've also moved into a networked economy. Of course, with the internet has absolutely changed everything. Again, technology revolutionizing the way we work. We have unlimited mobility potentially, and everything is about innovation. And this is kind of an overly simplistic image, but it's very fundamentally important. We have moved away from being bound by paper. Every process in the office was determined by paper. Your desk was essentially a receptacle and a kind of a movement system for paper, to being able to work anywhere, because our technology allows us to do that. But the workplace is also much more important than simplistic kind of engineering issues. And I love these two images. The one on the left is a depiction of Saint Jerome in his chamber. And this is a saint from around the 6th century, but it's painted about 800 or 900 years later by a 14th century artist. And it's absolutely rich with a kind of a symbolism and a narrative structure, much of which is in fact impenetrable today because we're not really familiar with the mythologies that are built into this image. But it is absolutely fascinating because it is an image that works like a novel. An art historian could move across the page on this image and actually reveal that story. On the right, we have a modern worker who's been liberated from paper, well, actually not entirely. This image is from 1995, and the dilemma in 1995 was, how do we accommodate this new kind of working situation when we don't have any prior model to fall back on? The needs now have become quite basic. This is someone who needs light and space and a place to work comfortably, needs to connect with people, and a place to put stuff, but only a small amount of stuff. And it's also interesting that this is Shiat Day of 1995 in Los Angeles, I think pretty much the first virtual office or mobile office. And they were, of course, hitting a lot of the problems right from the word go, and it's immediately obvious that she's sitting on a chair that is ergonomically appalling. And it will not work for very long. So the old model has been inverted into the new model. When I was young, the old model was very, very dominant in offices. You had about 70% of your workspace was private. It was either a desk or an office. And then there was a limited amount of group workspace, meeting rooms and things like that. We're now in a situation where that ratio has been reversed. We are now mostly group-oriented. We mostly go to work to collaborate with people. And the individual space has been shrunken down so that the group space could benefit from that. And where we're going, of course, more and more is, especially in the issue of large organizations, because this is the major challenge of large organizations, is how do you actually get away from fractured communities and get to a goal of one community? Because it's only really with one community that you can increase the fluidity of connections between people and create a sense of belonging to something that's valuable. So what are the determinants of social space? I'm going to suggest that there are these kind of 6 primary issues, all of which play into how a workplace needs to function. The first one is the culture model, which is the one actually that people talk about least because it seems the least easy to define. But I'm going to make an attempt to talk about that. Then there's the role of the city and what that means in large-scale workplaces. There's the issue of what we call serious play, and using the phrase disruption in play. And then fluidity and transparency, choice and diversity, and human scale, community and collaboration, all very obvious things that need to be addressed. So initially in the culture model, we're in this interesting moment in time where, again, technology has been moving so fast that we are kind of culturally incapable of keeping up with its development. So I believe we've moved from a shift of maturity and sophistication, a closed system with the challenges of that, to an immature and naive open system. And these two images, I think, are kind of really interesting. We've got a painting of Marie Antoinette on the left, probably around 1780 or thereabouts, and a picture of a young girl of similar age, actually, probably about 5 years ago in a fashion magazine. And what's strange about the image on the left? It's obviously that Marie Antoinette's got gray hair. Why does Marie Antoinette have gray hair? She has gray hair because it's cool to have gray hair. And it's cool to have gray hair because in 1770, power resided with rich old people. And that was the aspirational point in 1770, 1780. So young girls wanted to have gray hair. It's really kind of fascinating. Not at all the case with the girl on the right, who's part of a youth culture and wants to identify with tribes of the youth culture. So I think we've moved from a condition of maturity, and this is because technology has been changing so slowly over the centuries prior to the Palace of Versailles and Marie Antoinette, that they were able to build on a level of agreement because the power structures resided with old people, the money resided with older people, and the sort of chain of patronage was very clear. And now we're in a completely different situation where we are trying to catch up with where the world is going. So having an immature condition is actually much freer and more open to experimentation and change. That image on the right is one of our projects, which clearly is quite immature. It's actually a project we did for the Disney store in Los Angeles, where we developed a rotomolded plastic hexagon honeycomb, because they produced so many soft toys that they really needed some places to put them. So that became part of the office storage system. These are a couple of other images of the same project. Now, getting onto the urban paradigm, we think that the notion of extending urban thinking and urban design and the character and the sort of lexicon of the city into the interiors of large buildings makes total sense for one reason, if no other, and that is that people recognize all the cues of the city. We've been inculcated and bred in cities, and it's a familiar environment, and therefore one that one can play with and in a meaningful way that creates conversations that can be extended and enjoyed beyond ourselves. And there's two aspects of this. There's an active aspect. The city organizes complexity, and we are actually looking to organize complexity in the way in which these large communities have developed. We were, of course, talking about communities. Probably the scale is not as common in South Africa, although it's becoming common, I think, because I heard that there's like 1 million square feet of Absa bank space in Cape Town, which is really kind of extraordinarily large scale. But we're talking about communities, anything from sort of 1,000 people to 50,000 people, very commonly in the projects that we are dealing with. So it was an early realization we had that in the medieval city, all of the things that we are talking about with our clients are essentially embedded in that city. All of the sort of archetypes that we think about and that people kind of often romanticize about and go on kind of holiday, vacation tours around old European cities. It's all about connecting with these aspects of a built accretion of human achievement, which is really quite marvelous. So for us, it's been often a question, well, the scales are never, of course, on the size of cities like that, but how do you make villages in buildings? How do you create the arteries, the public connection spots, the landmarks, the destinations in buildings that are actually meaningful? And this is a project we did for Macquarie Bank in London, where they had been so sold on the idea that floors create silos between business groups, and they wanted their business groups to connect better, that they were prepared to cut massive holes all the way through the building. This atrium didn't exist in the building until they took the lease, and this is purely a lease. They don't even own the building. And they were prepared to cut the hole all the way through it and support the notion of a vertical village with its staircase that was deliberately designed to maximize the speed of connecting between the different points where you needed to be, depending on where functions were located on different floors. So that's actually something that's quite wonderful about it. This isn't really a design staircase. This is a staircase that connects points of meaningful destinations across the building and therefore becomes something kind of fascinating and both functional at the same time. Now that's actually the image from one of the meeting rooms right at the very top down the space. So number 3, disruption and play. I think some of the people have probably read about the notion of serious play in the workplace, but anyone who's involved in creative industries knows how important it is to work in an environment that fosters play and actually provokes and excites people rather than makes them overly comfortable. And you don't have to go very far to do that a lot of the time. There's only one tiny difference between those two words. Again, this is a little project we did for Disney Store where they wanted a very large meeting room and they also wanted space for 200 people to be able to gather for very large meetings, but didn't want to actually devote that much amount of space. So we said, well, we could build a meeting room with walls that come down, and then you can sit on the bricks, and then you can put it back, and we could time how long it took to do that, and I think it was 25 minutes with 2 men. And those are made of soft foam, Kinsey Milan foam from Belgium, so they're very comfortable. And that worked quite well, but it's not a sort of an obvious solution. You can actually see that room in the middle there, and you can see how this building is also, by being a number of buildings pushed, I think there's 3 buildings pushed together, and then creating a kind of a village inside, it also kind of made quite a delightful environment for the occupants. And other ways of inserting messages into buildings can be really quite simple. That's J. Walter Thompson in New York, where we'd made an awful lot of meeting rooms out of tents because the idea of making them flexible, movable, was and inexpensive was very attractive. And then we could also use messages on those tents because this was an agency that was very keen on rebranding itself as storytellers at the time. This is 2005. So we chose, or actually rather they chose, the first lines of like provocative, interesting novels to cut into the fabric. Fluidity and transparency, also incredibly important. And transparency it's a cliche quite a lot in my business, but what's so important about it is this idea of knowing what's going on around you all the time. And knowing what's going on around you all the time makes you connected to all the activities that are happening around you in the workplace. And even though you might think of a lot of that as being just potentially disruptive, it gives you the ability to move much faster, move things much faster, move people much faster, move relationships much faster, and engage in new kind of endeavors much faster. It engenders accountability and engagement on a very obviously powerful level. The office is moving today, and it can be moving in all sorts of shapes and forms, and people move it as well. And I think we've hopefully seen an end to the image on the left. I don't think we've ever built a corridor, or if we have, it was possibly to a restroom or something like that. The image on the right is from our project for Google's headquarters. We're opening up that building, and I think we did cut these holes in between the floors. It was something that was so important. And this is an image we actually did way back in the 90s, 1998, when we did one of our early projects for a digital studio for 20th Century Fox. And we compared how we were handling the circulation space with a building that was done for Accenture, which was supposedly at the cutting edge of business in 1988, not our project, which has a simple old-fashioned corridor running around a particularly straightforward little building, and no real opportunity to connect with anyone whatsoever. It's kind of a racetrack situation. And with Fox, we were able to talk about the spaces that connected everyone in a completely different way, and how we could open those up, and how we could actually populate those with shared functions and a sort of purposeful variety of environments, so that those spaces became much more like exploring a kind of a Moroccan village or something like that, and much less like unbelievably boring corridors. And what was driving us too was some research that had happened around the same time, which is that image, the guys in the Hungarian heated baths playing chess, which is always great. The red area of that diagram is in the range of time between 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening. How much space do people spend in the office but away from their desks? And it turned out to be this huge amount of time. And this was done in observational studies on a large number of businesses. And it's now kind of common knowledge that a desk in an office is typically only occupied somewhere between 40 and 60% of the day. So there's a huge amount of time when desks are unoccupied. And a lot of the work that we've been involved in is how to change that type of situation, because it's a big waste of real estate and therefore money and carbon footprint. And also, it tends to decrease the sense of community in an office and the buzz in an office. We were very lucky to work with a company that had a very radical idea about how to connect everyone, which was Mother, the ad agency in Britain, in 2004. And they wanted a table, a single table for 200 people. And the background of this was that they started off as a very small agency with 6 people around a kitchen table. And as they grew the agency, they just grew the table. And when I started working with them, they had a 75-person table, and now they wanted a 200-person table. And they just rented leased a large warehouse space in Shoreditch. So we had this nice big blank canvas with a couple of obstructions in the space, like elevator blocks. So in kind of coming up for the right idea, we were inspired by this racetrack on the roof of the Turin factory in Turin, which dated from the 1920s, and the idea that that could be turned into a table. So we extrapolated that into the space, and it's 14 foot wide, and I think it's 250 foot long, and wrapped around the room. And then we managed to convince the client to build it in concrete, which was completely ridiculous. And everyone loved it for exactly that reason. So it really could have driven a car on it had it not had brakes in it. So that was the one thing that dealing with large scale, you can't actually do such monumental forms without breaking them to rationalize the circulation. So it's been in operation, and I visited about a year ago and was absolutely amazed that it looks absolutely pristine. They've looked after it very well, and they've just grown the company by trying to find other areas to push single tables. And it's super collaborative, and the desk is no longer a desk. It's a thing you can move around on, you can play on. I think they've had skateboard parties, they've had fashion shows on it. It's really worked very well for them. The only thing that's been disastrous is that the underside of the table has badly scoured people's jeans. And they also move the people every 4 weeks, so there's a constant rotation around the space, and that means it actually gets cleaned up on a regular basis. Choice and diversity, very, very obvious things, but usually very poorly addressed in modern office projects, because the touch points for our clients tend to always revolve back to how many desks we got, how many offices have we got. We started working with Nokia on their headquarters in Helsinki about 7 years ago. And it was very funny. They were finding it very hard to understand why they needed a lot of different types of work settings. A desk was perfectly okay. And then we came up with an ad that they had all over Europe at the time, which talked about their N95 Nokia phone. And the tagline was not one thing but many, about all the multifunctional aspects of that phone. So we used that back on them and said, this is really what you need to walk the talk. And that sold this idea that there could be a whole range of different work environments for their people. And then we also, of course, worked on the master plan for Googleplex in Silicon Valley. We were lucky enough to win the competition on that. And that was kind of another scale that we hadn't actually sort of dealt with before. And a company that's growing at such a rapid pace, they wanted us to do this project in 9 months. We managed to get it finished, but it was kind of really more of a race than anything else. In the course of this, we went through a study of, I'm not going to show all of it to you, because there was a whole series of layers of constraints and opportunities that we were able to develop and then mesh together and see how you can distribute functions around a building in a rational way, and also be sensitive to things like time utilization, so that how this building reacted over time could really make sense, because people worked late in the night, came in early in the morning, needed to recreate, needed to go to the gym and things like that. And of course had fabulous food offerings that Google is famous for. So we also needed to kind of deal with the issue that software engineers need a huge amount of focused time, quiet time, and so we needed to zone the building in what we called like thermal contours of hot to cold areas, hot being acoustically live and cold being as dead as possible. And we also developed, which I'm not going to show you here, a series of glass rooms that ranged around the perimeter, which were the super quiet spaces for the engineers to work at. Oh, actually, that on the left there is an image of one of the typical workrooms. They're not offices per se. They have 3 to 4 people working in them with movable furniture so they can reconfigure depending on how they're working together. And we managed to convince them to make them purely out of glass so that we would maintain views to the outdoors for everyone who was inboard from the perimeter. And then gave ourselves the challenge of how do you cope with the acoustics in a space like that. So we developed a padded tent ceiling that was pulled up in tension with a way of using the collar at the top of the ceiling to distribute services back into the room. And that was kind of a really fun technical challenge there. Another image from Google of some of the sort of Main Street space. And then after Google, we got involved with Macquarie Bank in Australia with an extraordinary project to move them from incredibly conventional space with everyone working on the identical kind of bench system to an office where they could choose to work anywhere. And here they were going to go, with a large division, 3,000 people, they were going to go completely mobile. And they adopted this Dutch concept of activity-based working, which was very new then. And we worked together with a Dutch consultant developing different types of work settings that were particularly focused on exactly how they worked. So there was an observational study done to develop the work settings specific to work tasks. And then there was a pilot done where these different work settings were actually built in prototype form. Business groups were rotated through the pilot, so they created change agents for this different type of working, which is, from a change management point of view, incredibly important, because they were going to do such a major change that any kind of blip in the performance of this new facility could have a major negative impact on the bank. So this is a really fun kind of exercise to get into. And as you can see from a typical floor here, this isn't a typical floor in a typical office building. There's a whole range of different ways in which you can use the space. And all of them have gone through this kind of quasi-scientific process of getting the ratios to perfectly right for the different business units. And at the same time, keeping it flexible so you can move business units around the different floors of the building. It also had the magnificent opportunity to influence its atrium because the building wasn't built at the time that the lease was signed. So we had this opportunity to animate the atrium with meeting pods so that you could continuously see the activity going on in the bank in a kind of a very celebrated way, because from the bottom of the atrium, there was 26 meeting pods ranging up the space, and you would see activity in all of them. And it was almost like a kind of a modern cathedral in creating these tableaus. And the double benefit was, if you're in those meeting rooms, you could see across into all the floors on the opposite side and see what people were doing in a super transparent way, which again was kind of conceptually for a bank a huge leap away from the usual barriers that banks put up. That's a kind of typical view that a client would get into the space where in the past they would never see this in any shape or form because of the security barriers that the bank necessarily has erected. But in this case, you are, from a distance point of view, just far enough away from anyone on the other side that you cannot actually read anything on a computer screen. So finally, in a way, the most obvious issues, human scale, community, and collaboration, the idea that you need to develop manageable groups and tribes, you need to develop neighborhoods because you need to give people the sense of belonging to something at a scale that is meaningful for them, because being a small number in a huge organization is not an attractive thing. And we also realized very quickly that the problems that we're dealing with really are exclusive to large corporations, because community fails so easily at a large scale, whereas companies that are up to the size of about 40 or 50 people, the network of relationships is something very manageable for people. And we studied the offices of Wired magazine in San Francisco in the late 90s and thought that they had this kind of brilliant solution of completely, at that time, completely open doors with technology hanging out all over the place and anyone working anywhere. But there was a kind of an attendant chaos to that and also a sense of nebulousness around the groups, the various business groups. So we thought it was possible to rationalize that by identifying business groups in a way that had more character, but also to be able to make them flow into each other, necessarily flow into each other because the scale of those groups would flux. And from that we developed this kind of somewhat silly word of slinky space that we've actually used in all of our projects, that you should never create silos through architecture. All workspace needs to flow into all other workspace. And then lastly, I thought I'd just touch upon a project we've only just finished, partly because it's so new, and also because it was kind of super fun, and also because it was super controversial. We've got a lot of media attention for it, a lot of it negative comments as well as positive comments. So it's quite amusing to show it. The negative comments never bothered us at all because we knew that the client and the client people really, really liked this space, and they liked the whole process. And for us, it was fairly unique. This was going to be a table that solved the problems of the table that we had done before, the mother table, meaning that if you break the table, you just lift the table up. And we could make the surface continuous. And this is the first drawing we showed to the client, saying, okay, we'd like to do a big space. You have essentially a street block. It's from 19th Street to 20th Street in New York. A really great through space. It's a table for 125 to 175 people, a scale that will flex. And if we throw the whole space throw the whole table through the space, we're going to need to break it and lift it up in places because we need that to follow the movement patterns. And the space is encircled by offices that most of which were there already. So we needed to save quite a bit of money because this was a client that had a budget that was about 70% less than a normal office challenge. And then the paths, which are the yellow lines, we said, okay, these are the routes you need to do to connect to the important different parts of the space, so we need to lift up the table along those lines. And the client was it's called the Barbarian Group, really amazing young internet advertising agency, populated with people, I think almost everyone in their 20s, and completely open to new ways of working and completely open to be collaborating in a very fluid way. So this was the first floor plan. You can kind of see every little seat, and you can see where the table lifts up and down. And we started making models using cardboard and seeing how we could shape the table in a very simple way. That's a cross-section through the room underneath. As you can see, it didn't have a very high ceiling height. And then I'm running through the process just because it's kind of fun with this one. Sketches about how we could structure the waves of the table, and it creates a kind of a network of plywood, playing with the top surface. Actually, we didn't do it yellow in the end, but we had to try that out just to see what it looked like. And that's the yellow model. And then also the idea of cutting holes when the table happened to get very wide and then creating little work areas within the holes. And that's the wireframe for the CAD model. So the CAD model was being constantly manipulated and developed. We had an engineer take it on at a certain point, and then we had to redraw it all over again because the engineer decided he needed to structure it a little differently. So it was a very long process in the computer. And then it was built by a company in Los Angeles called Machinius. It was built in Los Angeles, and all the components were shipped to New York. And it was built by robots following a cutting pattern that came out of that computer model, very, very literally. So that's a quick shot in construction. And then you enter the space in this, through this fairly modest little reception area, and then that's the first image you get of the table. I have a few images of the table where they are kind of without people because we shot it just before it got occupied initially. The surface is just MDF in a huge number of pieces, which have then been joined together. The seams have been finished with Bondo, which is a kind of putty, and then painted, and then a metallic fleck was added, and then a surfboard resin. Actually, it was kind of what they call an eco-resin now, so it was purely water-based, was poured over it more or less in one pour. So over a period of about 36 hours, they started at one corner, and it's really quite amazing to see, and with a bunch of people would be kind of washing this liquid over the table and then having to push it up the waves, because if they dropped it down the waves, it would create kind of unmanageable streaking. And the spaces underneath it came out kind of really quite beautifully, without any real design about where connector plates went and things like that. It was very much a raw slotting together of everything. And then these spaces, of course, underneath became fabulous opportunities for creating kind of high counters and low seating areas and storage areas and things like that. And this is an image from the back part of the space. And you get a sense of what it's like to kind of work underneath these. We applied acoustic material to the undersides of the coffers, so it's actually really quite silent under there. A good place for making phone calls as well. And there's a bar as well, which is a focal point in the design. And this is the point where 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 arches came together, and the structure got particularly complicated at that point. And the engineer came back and he said that he wanted the depth of the members to be something in the region of, I think it was 32 inches or something, which is really kind of huge. So we got into it a little closer and we asked them, where does it need to be 32 inches? Where does it need to be 16 inches? Where does it need to be 12 inches? And then we were able to actually shape the underside based on all the structural stresses. And that actually ended up with this thing that looks very organic, but it is in fact a reflection of the structural forces in the plywood. And this is what it's like in use today. Some more images. And it is not a loud space. A lot of the negativity has implied that this is loud, noisy, and appalling. We had a method of adding some acoustic attenuation to the ceiling, and the client decided to forego it because he said the acoustics were just fabulous. And the waves actually seemed to diffuse sound rather than amplifying any reflections. Those images aren't staged, by the way. The photographer kind of shot those live. And this is sort of interesting because it's the cutting pattern. I think there's 870 different sheets, and they're all cut from 4x8 plywood, and then numbered and then sent off to New York. Because all of this had to go in a very small elevator. That was one of the kind of challenges of this project. And then one of the interesting questions we got asked afterwards, which the client kind of came up with a brilliant answer to, was, okay, well, what happens if it cracks? Because they're going to party here, and someone is going to be jumping up and down on the table somewhere, and there will be a crack. And client's brilliant answer was, well, there's this tradition called kintsugi in Japan that goes back about 400 or 500 years, where if someone broke something, instead of concealing, attempting to hide or kind of get rid of the repair, they would amplify the error and use a combination of resin and gold dust to kind of create these incredible lines that celebrated the imperfection. So thank you, that was it.